So we are starting the nutrition clinic virtually. Thank you guys for being flexible. Michael's going to lead us through, talk about some general nutrition and then some tips for throughout training and race day. If you guys will all go ahead and mute yourselves, we'll stay muted throughout Michael's presentation, and then at the end we'll take some questions. So if you have questions throughout, you can type them into the group chat, and I can always jump in and interrupt Michael if I feel like we need to as we go along, or we can just open up for questions at the very end. All right, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah. So like Stephanie said, if you guys have questions along the way, definitely stop me because I don't want us to be so far past whatever you had a question about that, the question is no longer there for you or anything like that. So as we go, definitely feel free to stop me. Like Stephanie said, it's kind of just easiest if everybody stays muted during, so we don't have a bunch of background noise and stuff. But if you have questions and you don't want to type the whole thing out, just put in the chat box, I have a question, and I'll stop. I've got the chat box open, and Stephanie can stop me too, but we can stop and take the question. You can come off mute and say the question instead of having to type it all out if you want, but I think that's probably just the easiest thing. So today, talking about nutrition, we'll talk about a few big things. So kind of going through some objectives, what you guys can expect to get out of today. First thing is we'll talk about the macronutrients. So I think we've all heard about macronutrients in some capacity. And we'll talk about what those 3 macronutrients are, what each of their functions are, sources of each of the macronutrients, and their role in the body, obviously. Then we'll kind of use that conversation that we have. So that's that background. So we'll use that then to guide our conversation on what kind of nutrients we should be focusing on pre-workout, what we should be doing to make sure that we have really good workouts, what we should be doing during workouts to make sure that we're, performing our best and not bonking or anything. And then we'll cover what to do after workouts to make sure that we're recovering optimally so we can work out really well tomorrow and the day after and just keep having really great training sessions. And then we'll also get into covering just some general hydration guidelines. So we'll talk more about that from the perspective of what to do throughout the rest of the day to make sure that you stay hydrated just for life in general. And then we'll get into some more specifics on being hydrated for our actual sports activity, training, whatever you want to call it. Cool. So we'll hop in with the macronutrients. So just show of hands in the chat box, just say me, I guess is probably the easiest thing. If you've heard of the macronutrients or what all 3 of them are, just say me in the chat box. It's a lot harder to be interactive through this.
I'll kick us off here.
Yeah. There's always I'm never sure how long to wait with something like this because there's always a delay where you're trying to pull up in the chat box and type in the chat box and everything. And so I want to give people ample time, but I also don't want you guys to just stare at me not talking.
Yeah. So if you haven't found the chat, if you just hover over that bottom part, or if your screen is shrinked in, you can click the little ... and then click on chat and it'll pop up to the side. Yeah.
So if you haven't heard of the macronutrients, the 3 macronutrients are carbohydrates, fat, and protein. All 3 are super important. We don't want to skip out on any of them, and we don't want to, they're all important for different reasons. So we'll start with carbs. That's a good one to usually start with. Everybody likes carbs. So carbohydrates are really the way that you can best think about them is your body's energy source. So carbohydrates are a preferred energy source, especially during activity. They're a really quick burning energy source and they're really efficient. So they're going to be our most efficient energy source. I keep saying energy source and it sounds weird at how much I've repeated it, but it's, so carbohydrates are really during activity, our primary energy source. And some of the sources of carbs, you can think about your traditional things. You've got potatoes, sweet potatoes, any of our starchy foods like rice, pasta, breads, any of that kind of stuff. Fruit's also a really great source of carbohydrates. So you can get that from those. And the way to think about carbs is also So carbohydrates, so we think of like table sugar. Table sugar is like a fairly simple, like to get into the biochemistry of it, it's like a fairly simple molecule. Carbohydrates are just much longer chains of sugars. So carbohydrates they don't always have to be sweet, obviously, like, bread doesn't tend to be sweet. Potatoes aren't particularly sweet. But they are longer chains of sugar. So they can be broken down in the body into sugars, which then get quickly utilized for energy. So we'll move into fat next. So fat is one of our other macronutrients. It's our most calorically dense macronutrient. So like per gram, it has more energy than carbohydrates or fat. Carbohydrates or protein. And it is also pretty much our other energy source. So at low level activity, like think about sitting around, walking around, even like maybe into a light jog, light bike ride, we're still probably burning a good amount of fat for energy. But as that intensity increases, we're going to transition over to burning predominantly carbohydrates. So in addition to being like slow burning energy source, fat's also really important for fat in our body. Like we do have to have body fat. It's also important for making like hormones and stuff like that. So definitely super important, something we don't want to like totally skip out on. So then that leaves us with protein. So protein is complex molecules made up of amino acids. So amino acids are what makes up the muscle and protein in our body. So kind of makes sense. Protein is like makes up the proteins in our body. So the good way to think about this from like a sports and training training side is think of this as like our major recovery nutrient to think of. So when Stephanie could probably speak even more to this, but essentially when we do activity of any sort, think of like if you do resistance training, but even when you go out for a bike ride or run, essentially we're causing like really microscopic damage to the muscle. Like that's the whole idea behind it. Like that's the way it works is you cause a little bit of damage and then your body rebuilds even stronger so you can take on that activity without causing damage as much. So if you think about it from that perspective, when we go out for like training sessions, it's going to be super important to get that protein in afterwards to make sure that we're recovering properly, we're rebuilding muscle optimally, to make sure that we're getting stronger, we're getting better, we're getting faster, all of that. Does all of that make sense? Does anybody have any questions about any of that? I guess I should probably also talk about like sources of each of protein and fat. So while you guys are thinking of questions potentially, so sources of fat are going to predominantly be from like our meats, just like as a byproduct of meat. It's also going to be like any of our oils, so nuts, seeds, oils, anything like that. So olive oil, peanut oil, any of those oils or fats. You also get it in some other places like avocados, like the go-to example of a like plant fat that we like eat the plant portion of, but also nuts, legumes are sources of some fat. Proteins, that's going to predominantly be like our meats. So again, like, depending on what type of meat it is, like turkey, chicken tend to be leaner meats. But then you look at like your beefs and pork and stuff like that, and they tend to be a little bit higher fat, but that doesn't mean that there's not lean cuts of those. So you can get pretty lean cuts of beef and stuff like that. But those are all excellent sources of protein. Seafood, you'll get some of the soy products, like tofu, tempeh, any of those are going to be really good sources of protein. As far as plants go, like people like to point towards like spinach or beans or anything like that. And there is some protein in those, but it's not going to be in like nearly the concentration that you've got it in any of like the meats. Even dairy is going to be like a pretty good source of protein. But with dairy, so you think of like your traditional dairy, like if you go buy a yogurt, it's going to be like a higher fat protein. So good source of protein, but we're also getting like a considerable amount of fat with it. We can kind of combat that by buying, non-fat yogurts, like low-fat cheeses, lower fat milk, stuff like that. Does that does that help? Does everybody kind of have like a good picture of the macronutrients, where we can get each of the macronutrients, like what foods are like particularly good sources? Cool. I don't hear any objections, so we're going to keep right on moving. So in the chat box, based on kind of that conversation we just had, what do you think would be, just like everybody throw in there what you think your guess is of those three macronutrients, carbohydrates, protein, and fat, what do you think are going to be particularly important for us to get in before a workout? Yeah, good work, guys. Yeah, everybody's getting it. Yeah, so carbohydrates are going to be particularly important for us to get in before workouts. So with fat, we have a pretty good amount of storage. Like we have a pretty good store of fat in our bodies just through body fat. Even in really lean athletes, there's, I mean, if you think of 5-6% body fat, that's like a considerable amount of fat that we could potentially, use for energy if like we got stranded on an island or something. But with carbohydrates, we have a much smaller store. So even if we, I think a lot of people, especially if you've kind of been involved in sports in some capacity, you've heard of carb loading. So even if we carb load, we can really only expect to get somewhere in the range of 2,000 calories from glycogen. So we really can't store that much in the grand scheme of things. So it's important to get carbs in before a workout to make sure that we've kind of got those glycogen stores topped off and to make sure that we've got plenty of energy for our workout. So the size and the amount of carbs that we take in is going to really depend on our workout. So if we're going out for a 30-minute shakeout run, less important for us to take a super big carb snack or anything like that. That may be something where, if you just ate lunch a little while ago or you just had your afternoon snack, we don't really need to do anything extra on top of that. If it's a shorter workout, easier workout, longer, harder workouts, we're going to want to make sure that we're topping up with some more carbs. So that's going to be so dependent on the person that I don't want to say like this many grams is what everybody needs because everybody is different. But again, it's going to be tailored to the workout. And then the other side of that is going to be how far before your workout that we're having our snack or meal. So the pre-workout period you can kind of think of as like the 3 to 4 hours before a workout, like pretty much 4 hours before all the way up until you go start running, start riding, whatever it is. That's like our pre-workout period. So if we're having a meal, we just want to make sure, again, that there's carbs in that meal, making sure that we've got, like if we're having a salad for lunch every day, make sure we've got some carbs on that salad, whatever it is. And the further out from our workout we are, the more complex that can be. So the more fiber, the more fat, the more protein we can have in that. The closer we get to our workout, so when we're within that 30 minutes to an hour of a workout, we want that to be a much simpler, smaller snack because it takes our body's time to digest. Like we don't just, as soon as you eat something, it doesn't immediately get digested. So the last thing you want is to eat like a giant Arby's sandwich 30 minutes before you go run because that's just like not going to sit well. I mean, it might, I don't know. Everybody's different. Some people could tolerate that, but a lot of people will not tolerate that very well. So if we're in that like really close window, we're better off doing something like a sports drink because we've got carbohydrates there. We've got some electrolytes to kind of jumpstart that, which we'll get into in the during workout piece in just a minute. And then you're also getting fluid to make sure that we're heading into workouts hydrated. Let's see. Does that make sense? Definitely like stop me if you have any questions. So yeah, so basically the way you can think about it, think of it like a timeline. The further out we are from a workout, the bigger, more complex a meal can be. The closer to a workout, the smaller, simpler it needs to be. Much more like familiar foods is the other way I put it for people. Like if you never eat sweet potato before you go run, don't eat sweet potato 30 minutes before you go run. Like stick to something familiar, whether it's like a couple pieces of toast with some peanut butter, like whatever it is, just like something familiar tends to be the best thing. Cause if you've eaten it 1,000 times and you know you tolerate it well, then we're not like playing that game of like, am I going to tolerate it this time? So then we've fueled up, we've topped off our carbohydrates before a workout. What about during a workout? What do we think might be important to get in during a workout? This period doesn't really need as much like time defining because it's the time that you're working out. I'm going to assume that nobody's putting it in the chat because it's the same guess as before, and you're right. So carbs are going to be our big focus for during workouts as well. Again, because they're that quick energy source and they're our body's preferred energy source for like higher levels of like higher intensity levels and for activity. So during workouts, there's really, three big things we should focus on. That's going to be fluid, carbohydrates, and electrolytes. So when we sweat, we're getting into an even bigger conversation that I didn't outline, but we're going to go there because it's very important. So when we sweat, it's where we're losing fluid. That's the obvious piece that everybody knows. And there's also like the salt that people talk about. That's the electrolytes. So we lose sodium, chloride, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. Like we lose all of those in our sweat. But the really big one that we're most focused on replacing is sodium. That's going to be like just the highest volume typically for people. They lose that in the highest amounts. That's the most likely to cause cramping issues, just cause like general fatigue and muscles not firing as well is going to be the loss of those electrolytes and fluid. So really important during workouts for us to take in the fluid and electrolytes to make sure that we're staying hydrated, to make sure our muscles can keep firing, all of that kind of stuff, and we're not cramping up or anything like that. So the common question that usually comes after this is there a certain like activity length that we need to start doing that at? And there is. So if it's like, again, I circle back to like the 30-minute shakeout run. If you're doing something like that, not as like important to get in those electrolytes because we're just like likely during that length of activity not going to lose so much that we can't replace it with what we do after our workout and throughout the rest of the day. So our general rule of thumb is less than an hour. You can kind of just stick with water. Anything more than an hour, we're going to want to start switching over to a sports drink that has the carbs, has the electrolytes, along with the fluid. So that's a really good rule of thumb for cooler weather, milder temps and humidity. But as we're heading into warmer months, we're going to want to jumpstart that a little bit earlier. So kind of as we head into hot weather, what we say is if it's hot, humid, and your activity is going to be longer than a half hour, so we call it 3 H's, so hot, humid, half hour, we're going to want to go ahead and start that sports drink then at the half hour mark instead of anything under an hour. So think of when it's 80 and 95% humidity, that's like a really good time. Even if it's a 40-minute run, 45 minutes, 50 minutes, anything like that, you'll want to go ahead and start the sports drink then to make sure that we're getting everything in. And as far as sports drinks, like I'm trying to think of like all the common questions I get so that you guys don't have to like type too much stuff out or anything. As far as like what sports drinks to go with, so much of that depends on the person and what you're losing. So that's going to be like the kind of thing that I reinforce about nutrition in general is not everyone should do the same thing. Same thing with sports drinks. There's not like one sports drink that's good for everybody. So much of it depends on the individual, which is why we offer sweat testing. So that was actually like something that Chris picked up like years ago because she was frustrated with seeing people having these cramping issues or having performance issues. And they were kind of just like throwing darts blindly at the dartboard, trying to figure out what drink would work, how much sodium to take in. And people were going through these like really elaborate experimentation processes. And she thought like, there has to be a simpler way to know like what someone should do. And so instead of kind of guessing about it, we actually just measure how much sodium you're losing, how much chloride you're losing, and how much potassium. Again, those are the big three. The other piece of that is that calcium and magnesium are really expensive to test. So when we're already losing them in such small amounts, and they're the least likely to cause cramping problems, and they're expensive to test, it becomes less important that we test those. So again, we test those just to know for sure, but you can always start with kind of generic sports drinks. I mean, something like Gatorade has its place. Gatorade actually does like a ton of research into sweat and fueling and things like that. So while Gatorade is probably not optimal for everybody, it's definitely like a easy, readily available option for people to kind of like go with a sports drink, test out a sports drink. The other thing that I recommend to people is if you don't want to do like the sweat testing, if you don't want to put together like a customized plan for you, and you kind of just want to, like, one of the common things I get is I just want to use what's on course, like whatever your race is. If it's a running race, if it's a triathlon, like I get it with all of them. People say, I don't want to have to worry about carrying my own stuff. I don't want to have to worry about mixing bottles in advance, whatever it is. I just want to use what's on course. And that's totally fine. So if you know what's going to be on course at your race and that's what you want to try out, go ahead and get some on your own. Really common is like Gatorade's endurance formula. You're starting to see the new Noon endurance formula. That's starting to be at some races too. So if you're going to use what's on course during the race, like for your race, if you're using what they have on course, test it out in advance, use it in training, get used to it, make sure you tolerate it all right, all of those things. Because you'd hate to get there race day and try something new and it not go well or not provide for your needs, whatever it is. And that's kind of like, again, another overarching theme for all of what we talk about today is preparing for race day. So kind of a lot of this is about how we can get the most out of our training so that we show up in, kind of peak form and show up putting our best foot forward for the race. And that's one of the other pieces of this is we don't want to do anything new on race day. So anything you think you're going to want to do on race day, whether it's the breakfast before you work out, like before the race, what you drink during the bike, any of those things, test it all out in training, because you're going to like potentially identify problems. So it may be that something doesn't sit well. It may be that you hate the taste. It may be that you don't like it when it's warm. Any of those things are best to identify in training so that you're not trying to figure it out on race day and then come up with a backup plan on the spot. And then the other piece of that is you may also identify issues with your plan on how you plan to actually like get that fluid into your body. So if your plan is to use what's on course, try testing that out. Like set up like a mock aid station, like in your driveway kind of thing, and ride past and test it out. Test out refilling your bottles or whatever it is. Test out drinking your water from wherever your bottle cages are. Like all of those things, test it all out. And again, just not doing something new on race day. So these longer workouts, like the ride coming up, the brick workout coming up here in a few weeks, anything like that are great opportunities to test your pre-race planned meal. Does that make sense? Hopefully what I'm saying is making sense. So like if you, just to name an example, like if you want to have oatmeal before the race, like if that's kind of your go-to, make sure you test it out on those workouts along the way. So then that carries us. We've kind of topped off our glycogen. We've got some energy. We've gotten some water in before we go work out. We head into our workout. We've gotten our fluids in. We've gotten our electrolytes. We've gotten some carbs in to make sure we have that really killer workout, hitting all those hard intervals that Stephanie's given us. And then we're done with our workout. So what do we do now? So now, based on our macro conversation at the very beginning, what do you guys think? You can throw it in the chat box. What do you think is going to be important for us to get in after our workout? I'll give you guys just a minute to type that out. Yeah, so protein's going to be like one of our big pieces of emphasis. We're also, surprisingly, even though we've just emphasized carbs so much all the other times, yeah, water's a good one too. So even though we just emphasized carbs, we're going to emphasize carbs again. So again, I'm trying to think of like the best analogy, but essentially um, think of it as a gas tank. I mean, that's really like a pretty good analogy. Think of your gas tank and all the gasoline inside as your glycogen. You have a fixed amount. We only have so much. We can like try to refill it on the run, but like while we're on the move, but it doesn't always work so well. We can only get so much in, and you're still like using it as you pour into the gas tank. So kind of that's like a really good way to think of it. So after our workout, what we want to do, it's the same way as when you commute to and from work. You hop in your car, you drive to work, you've used up some gas. You drive home, you've used up some gas. And then depending on how long your commute is, you might have to stop for gas on the way home to make sure that you've got gas to get to work the next day. So our glycogen stores are kind of the same way. Essentially what we want to do is after a workout, we've used up a lot of that gas. We've used up the glycogen. So what we want to do is top off the carbohydrates to make sure that we've got that glycogen there for the next workout. Because if we don't top that off and we don't get enough carbs later in the day, the next morning, whatever your timeline is, if we don't get enough carbs, then we're kind of at a deficit heading into that next workout. So we've just got less energy heading into the next workout, which means we're probably not going to perform as well. We're not going to be able to push as hard and get as much out of it. So that's why the carbohydrates come into play after the workouts as well. Protein, like you guys said, awesome. That's also going to be super important. So that one, like we talked about at the very beginning with the actual role of each of the macronutrients, the protein is going to be really important to help the muscles repair, recover, build back even stronger so that heading into that next workout, we're like ready for it and totally recovered. And we're not just like, I don't know. I'm struggling to come up with analogies today, guys. I'm sensing like a theme here. Yeah, I don't know. And like if we're not all the way recovered, instead of just like continuing to put ourselves in a hole, we can just get in the carbs and protein after to make sure that we're kind of recovered and heading into that next workout and we're not just digging the hole deeper and deeper. And then the fluid, yeah, that's a really good one. So definitely making sure that we're rehydrating after. So if you've got your notepad handy, here's a little tidbit to write down. For every pound of weight that we lose during activity, we want to replace about 16 to 20 ounces of fluid. So if you weigh yourself before you go work out, so say you're going to run out your front door tomorrow morning. I don't know what Stephanie has planned for you guys for tomorrow for your workouts, but let's pretend for this example's sake that it's a run. So you're going to go run out your front door tomorrow morning. Before you get dressed for your run, go to the bathroom, weigh yourself, get dressed, go for your run. When you get back, strip down and weigh yourself again. However much weight you lost, say it was 2 pounds. So that's going to be 32 to 40 ounces of fluid that we need to replace. Because in that short of a period of time, any weight we lose is all water weight as it's called. So we're going to want to make sure we replace that to rehydrate, which, we talked about. Well, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So the fluid, super important post-workout, and we'll talk about that more in just a minute, about the importance of hydration in general throughout the day, and then kind of into recommendations for how much fluid we should be taking in during the day anyways. So getting back to the post-workout thing, there's kind of 2 time periods that I look at or focus on, break it down to in the post-workout period. So there's the 30 to 60 minutes right after your workout. So that's, say you drive out to the tobacco trail. That's pretty much the period from when you get back to when you get back to your car, loading your bike on the car, or, putting some dry clothes on, your drive home. That's kind of that immediate post-workout period. So in that period, what we do is going to depend on what we do next. So if we're going to be having like a normal meal, like if you work out first thing in the morning, you're going to come home and immediately have breakfast. then we can kind of just do that. Just let the breakfast or our lunch, whatever our next meal is, be our recovery meal, as long as we're having that within that 30 to 60 minutes after our workout. So again, kind of focusing or like circling back to what we've talked about and what you guys have all said in the chat box. In that 30 to 60 minutes after our workout, if we're having a meal, we want it to be pretty carb rich, protein rich. So like toast, eggs, if it's breakfast, having some sort of pasta, potatoes, sweet potatoes, any of our carb sources that we talked about, and then lean proteins. If we aren't going to have that meal for a longer period, if it's going to be longer than an hour, then we kind of want to get a snack in that 30 to 60 minutes to kind of tide us over and hold us until we can get that full meal. So the other way to think about it is get a snack in that 30 to 60 minutes after a workout, and then within 2 to 3 hours, make sure you've got a good meal that's rich in carbohydrates and has a good amount of lean protein. And again, those exact amounts are going to really depend on the person, all your activity, all of that kind of stuff. So hard to make like specific recommendations for numbers there because everybody's so different. But kind of just let your body guide you and eat how much you feel like you should. So listen to your body. Like if you're not hungry, don't eat a huge amount. If you're really hungry, don't just like eat, an apple slice and expect that to be good. Yeah. So does that make sense to everybody? Like kind of, if you can, like sound off in the chat box and let me know if that makes sense or if you have any questions about that.
Hey, Michael.
Yes.
I have a question for you. Isn't there kind of a general recommendation for the maximum amount of protein that you could absorb at one time? So if you take in too much, it won't really help you out?
Yeah. So really, especially like post-workout, it's kind of hard to take in like a huge amount. So I mean, really, like if we keep it to 40 or less grams is really like pretty reasonable for most people. But the other piece of that is it's kind of like a two-sided coin. So the other side of that is the carbohydrates. So it's actually for what we're doing. So this is all, this whole training program is built around a triathlon. So it's all largely endurance training. So when we get done with our workouts, there's kind of like an optimal ratio of carbohydrates to protein. And so that's a 4-to-1 ratio. So for simple math, so that's 4 parts carbohydrate to 1 part protein. So for simple math, that's like 40 grams of carb and 10 grams protein, or 60 grams carb and 15 grams protein. Yeah, I think I got all that right. So like if you're putting together your snack, that would be, 2 pieces of toast, like a serving of deli meat, or like a sandwich if you're going to have a sandwich, 2 pieces of bread, deli turkey, and then like a cup or 2 of fruit. So just like essentially the 4-to-1 ratio piece is the emphasis is largely on carbohydrates, and we want to get some protein in. So I think there's like this misconception, especially for like endurance athletes, that we should be like guzzling a protein shake right after. And people like just neglect carbohydrates, and then it's just not as optimal for endurance athletes.
There we go. We have a question from LB. How much carb intake pre-workout correlates to 2,000 calories of glycogen stores?
So this is like a pretty complex topic. I'm trying to think of like the best way to explain it. I'm like a very visual person, so I always think of like how I could draw things out, and I don't really know how to draw this out. So like I think the best way to think about it, so it's like I said, your gas tanks. You've got, most people walking around on a normal day, it's somewhere around probably 15 to 1,600 calories. So 2,000 we can kind of get to if we go through a very specific, it's like a 3 to 5 day protocol to carb load to like basically oversaturate our body with glycogen. that we can get to that 2,000, 2,200 maybe calories. So most of the time we're walking around with less than that, which is again why it's important to top off. But we're not, so our body tries to regulate that and keep those stores pretty good, like in a pretty good place. So if we're having carbohydrates throughout the day, not shying away from them, our body kind of keeps those topped off, and we have what's called like turnover. So throughout the day, you break some down and use it, and then you eat something, like you have your lunch and it tops it off, and then you break some down, and then your next meal tops it off. So it's that turnover. So, I mean, 2,000 calories in, like if you were, so your glycogen stores are hardly ever going to be totally empty, but to get 2,000 calories worth of carbohydrates would be 500 grams of carbohydrate. So that's like an insane amount of carbohydrate. You're definitely not going to eat that before a workout. You're not going to process that. If you try to eat 500 grams of carbohydrates at one time, you're going to be a miserable person. I mean, I love carbs as much as the next person, but that's a lot of carbs to eat at one sitting. So I'm hoping I'm answering your question. Basically, what it comes down to is we're looking to just like top it off a little bit to get to that maximized, like oversaturated store of glycogen that I talked about. There's like a specific carb loading protocol, like I said. So essentially what you do is like for a few days, you eat really low carb and you work out pretty hard to totally like deplete your stores of glycogen as much as you can. So it makes for like a very miserable few days. And then what you do is you don't work out hardly at all and you eat really high carb, like really excessive amounts of carbohydrates. And then because you had that period where it was really depleted, your body's like really hungry for it. And so it's just like storing as much as it can because it's like, oh no, we've not had any glycogen recently. So it just like keeps storing, and you can like store a little bit more than that like normal amount that you walk around with. So for most people, that's not realistic because it's such a complicated protocol leading into a race. So like the other thing is like that pre-race pasta dinner that everyone says they're carb loading with doesn't totally do that to like the maximal degree of carb loading. So, I mean, definitely emphasizing carbs the night before a race or something is fantastic. That's what we want to do. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, she wrote in the chat. Okay. Yeah, I think that was good.
Cool. So please, like, if you have other questions, let me know. So we talked about the 4-to-1 ratio. We talked about that 30 to 60 minutes. So for a lot of people, this is where I see people like slip up and not kind of do like the optimal thing is post-workout, people skip that snack or kind of prolong how long or like take too long to get that post-workout meal in. And so what ends up happening is people get super hungry and we either overeat or we just continue to be hungry all day long and can't get enough food is the other common problem. So if we can get that snack in, it really puts us in a better place. It makes sure that our body's got the carbs to help replenish all those glycogen stores that we've broken down. It's making sure our body's got the protein to help build and repair muscle. And it's also keeping us from just being like grouchy, hungry people. Like nobody wants that. So, yeah. And then again, so specific example, say that we're going to have our workout in the afternoon after work. Say you get off work early, I don't know, or you're working from home, you can check out of work a little bit early and go for a ride. So you get back, have a little snack with some carbs and protein. You can shower, kind of maybe log back into work, answer a few emails. And then again, within 2 to 3 hours of finishing that workout, that's when we're going to want to make sure that we get another meal that's got carbs, protein, fat, all the macronutrients, but definitely emphasizing the carbs and protein to continue with that repair process. So then on top of that, we already talked a little bit about it and kind of alluded to it, is the hydration piece. So the general rule of thumb, and there's again, the thing I'm going to harp on throughout all of this is there's like a ton of individual variation, but a general rule of thumb is that we want to drink half of our body weight in ounces of water per day. So that's, pretty easy math most people can do. Just take your weight, divide it by 2, and you need to drink that many ounces of water a day. But that is, again, a general rule of thumb. It's a starting place. Stephanie, I lied to you earlier. I do have a graphic for this. So hang on real quick. I'm going to go grab it.
Okay.
So if you guys go to Inside Out Sports, you might have seen this before hanging in the bathroom, but this is our P chart. So again, that half your body weight in ounces of water per day is kind of like a starting point. I don't know how well you guys can see this, but these are numbered 1 through 8. So we pretty much always want our P to be in this 1 to 3 range. The best way I know the colors probably aren't showing up super well, but the best way to think of it is like the color of pale lemonade or lighter. So we don't ever want our P to be like totally clear, but we also really don't want it to be these darker colors. That means we're dehydrated and we need to drink more water. So circling back to that general rule of thumb, if we're drinking that amount, so half our body weight in ounces of water, if we're drinking that and our P is still down here a lot, you might need more than that. If you're drinking that amount and your P is always clear, you might want to back off a little bit. You might just need a little bit less than that. And so when we talked earlier about the recommendations for replacing fluid that we lost during an activity, that volume, so the 16 to 20 ounces per pound of body weight that we lose, that does not get included in that half your body weight in ounces. So the half your body weight in ounces, so for example, if you're 150 pounds, that's 75 ounces of water. So any that you need to replace from your workout does not get included in that 75 ounces. That's all on top of, that's extra on top of the 75 ounces. So as athletes, that becomes like a lot of fluid that we need to take in a day, but it's really important too. Hydration is like one of the biggest things we can do to take care of ourselves. It's in current times, very pertinent. It's really good for your immune system. So being dehydrated actually like reduces your immune system a little bit. So definitely important to stay hydrated, helps keep muscles, joints working well, organs working well, keeps your blood like flowing through your body better. So when we get really dehydrated, we actually reduce our blood volume, which means everything has to work harder to pump that blood around. So we also, the mental aspect of it is like a huge side effect of dehydration. So you get really commonly is like grogginess, exhaustion, difficulty focusing, stuff like that. So a lot of people, you get that afternoon slump probably because we haven't had enough water all day, and people start reaching for that afternoon cup of coffee as like a pick me up, when a lot of times the water will actually like help you out more. You'll find that you're more alert if we're hydrated. But specifically for like activity, should have done this as like I should have planned ahead a little bit better and had this in like a virtual format. I think we have this hydration guide that I can send Stephanie. I'll send it to you and you can pass it out as like a bit.ly link so that they can download it as a PDF. And then you'll get all 6 panels. So this piece here talks about how fluid loss affects us. So the way that we typically look at fluid loss during activity is as a percent of your weight. So we don't necessarily look at, I lost 1 pound, 2 pounds. We look at that as a percentage of your body weight, because 1 pound for someone who's 200 pounds isn't that much. A pound for someone who's 115 pounds is a lot. So we look at it in terms of the percent of your body weight. So you guys probably can't see this, so I'm going to read it to you. So with like 1% weight loss during activity, we start to see thirst kick in. By 2%, we're definitely getting like really thirsty. Sometimes people will lose their appetite. People kind of just get like discomfort, like being a little bit uncomfortable in general, and we'll see our heart rate start to go up. By 3% of our body weight lost, people start to get really impatient. We have a decrease in blood volume. And again, that goes back to the increasing heart rate. Your heart's having to work harder. By 4% of our weight loss, we're starting to see nausea, slowing of like our actual physical work. Like we're not able to work as hard and put out as much effort. So it just continues to get worse and worse and worse and worse the more dehydrated we get. So what we kind of tell people is that we want to keep weight loss, no matter how long the activity is, to less than 2% of our body weight. So that's a pretty easy calculation. Like, again, going back to if you weigh yourself before a workout and after a workout, take that pre-weight and subtract your post-weight from it. So you see how much weight you lost, and then divide that by the pre-weight divided by, is that making sense? Sorry. I know I'm bad at explaining math. Stephanie, did that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Would you recommend them doing their own kind of sweat test, not really the sweat part, but hydration test where they, weigh themselves before a workout, don't drink anything during, and then weigh themselves after and kind of see how much they lost just as a quick test on their own?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely like a good thing to do. It's a good thing to do in general, like as a tune-up. So not necessarily something you have to do every run or every ride or whatever it is, but something to do every once in a while. And the other thing you can do that I actually tell people is like, once you think you've got a pretty good hydration plan in place, so you think you found the sports drink that works for you, you think you're getting in enough fluid, you're feeling good on your workouts, weigh yourself before, do your normal hydration plan, and then weigh yourself after and see how much you're losing. Because if you're still losing 3% of your body weight or 2% of your body weight, then that hydration plan isn't working as well as we need it to make sure that we can continue to work at those high levels and have our best performance. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Is there any kind of formula or something for if your race day or just a certain workout that you're doing happens to be on an extremely hot or humid day? Is there a certain amount you should increase over what you normally take in?
Not that I know of.
But just generally you should know that you might need to increase.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a really good point. And that kind of brings us back to what we were talking about during workouts with sweat. So essentially, like I said, there's the few components of sweat. There's the fluid piece. So think of that as water. There's the sodium, there's the electrolytes, all the electrolytes that get dissolved in that water that we sweat out. So electrolytes plus water equals sweat. So there's those two pieces. And so we kind of have to balance those two factors to make sure that we're replacing. But the other piece of this that makes it a little bit more complicated is that as environment changes, as our training status, so like how trained we are. So if you're really new to the sport, your sweat may be different than once you have been running or riding for longer and you're more used to the activity because it's less taxing on our body. So our body changes that sweat composition. Stress levels can affect it. So I think I said environment. But that's really an age, gender, all of those things affected as well. But we don't have as much control on those things. Whereas the environment changes much more frequently than our age does. So as the temperature increases and as humidity increases, our sweat composition changes as well. So the sweat that you have when it's the middle of winter, it's 30 degrees and windy and 20% humidity is going to be very different from the sweat that you have when it's 95 and 95% humidity. So for most people, even if your concentration doesn't change that much, your sweat rate increases. So we're losing more overall. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense to me.
Okay. So essentially, so that concentration of your sweat can change. So like the actual amount of sodium that's dissolved in the fluid as it comes out of your pores and everything can change with environment. But even if it doesn't change very much, our sweat rate increases as temperature and humidity go up. I mean, that's a very natural thing. You don't sweat as much when it's 30 degrees as you do when it's 95. And so as a result, when it's hot, humid, we lose more sweat, we're losing more sodium, we're losing more chloride, all the electrolytes, we're losing more fluid. So it's going to be even more important to get those in. So you can kind of expect seasonally, you can expect your hydration strategy to need to change a little bit. And so if you dial in our strategy for summer, you can expect to be able to scale that back for your winter training a little bit, which is good news, because if you're like a really heavy sweater, it means that you're not having to drink like 40 ounces an hour in the winter. So does all of that make sense? Does that equation make sense to everybody, and like how to figure out how much weight you're losing during activity? Are there any questions about any of that? Or any questions about anything in general? Because that kind of, honestly, like after covering the general hydration, the importance of hydration, and then that pre-post weigh-in protocol that we talked about, that kind of is the main stuff that I wanted to hit on.
Will you go into a little bit about timing of intake for nutrition and hydration during exercise? Like, do you recommend every 15 minutes for drinking and maybe every 30 minutes for eating or something like that?
Yeah. So a lot of that, again, is going to depend on the person. So it depends on like how much fluid you need to take in. So for like an example, with the sweat testing and everything, we've had people lose hardly any sweat, and we've had people lose, 50 plus ounces an hour. And we can't really process that much fluid. So it's not realistic to expect to take in all of that. About the most we can really expect to take in is 40 ounces. And even that, there's like individual variation. Like some people can't take in anywhere close to that. They just like don't tolerate it well. So, the thing I think of is like if someone has to get in 30 ounces an hour, you can't really space that out and do it every 30 minutes or anything. So some of it's going to be dictated by how much fluid you need to take in. Like you might just have to like drink more frequently to get it in. If you want to take a little bit smaller sips, you can spread it out a little bit more. But I think the 15-minute mark is really like a good one, where like if it's every 5 minutes, it feels like you're doing it the entire time. Whereas if you kind of focus on drinking every 15 minutes, it spaces it out a little bit, gives you a little break to focus on like other things, the race, and not just like constantly drinking water. So the 15-minute, kind of breaking it down into 15-minute segments, is a really good way to kind of chop up that hour and take it bite by bite. With calorie intake, a lot of that's going to depend on, again, your needs in particular. So if we're doing a sports drink, for some people, that'll cover their fluid needs, that'll cover their electrolyte needs, and it'll cover their calorie needs. But kind of more generally, like if you're going to have a gel, lining that up and having it like during one of those times where you're drinking fluid kind of helps just like wash it down. But if you're going to eat like solid food, especially on like longer training rides or anything like that, kind of alternating that in and doing it like every 30 minutes breaks the hour up into really good chunks for eating. Hopefully, does that answer your question, Stephanie?
Yeah, I think so. And then specifically for triathlon, I would just add in that it's easier to digest things on the bike. So you might want to think about taking in more nutrition while you're on the bike rather than on the run and then waiting till you're already depleted and tired. And probably all you can take into that point is what it's at the water stop, which will be more like water and Gatorade.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a really good point, because sorry, I keep putting this other headphone in because I can hear better with it in, but then like when I go to talk, I can't hear anything. So it's weird. But that's a really good point. So we can usually process and like take in a little bit more while we're on the bike. If you think about it, like that kind of like, to me, it just makes a lot of sense, because when you're running, you're actually like your stomach is literally getting jostled around. And so it just has a harder time like digesting as much stuff or digesting as complex of things. And so if we can kind of focus on the bike to make sure that we're feeling really well, then we can kind of ease off of as much of the solid food into the run and focus more on the fluid stuff that's like more better simpler, more easily processed. Plus, to your point, Stephanie, like thinking of how all the events line up, using the bike to kind of catch up from the swim, because it's like, I don't know anybody that can drink or eat during the swim. So you typically come out of the water just a little bit behind on like your nutrition and fluids. So using the bike to kind of catch back up on that a little bit and get out ahead of the run, and then essentially heading into the run in a really good place. Cause like you said, we don't want to get off the bike like totally depleted and then have to like shuffle through a run.
Right. And then maybe touch on differences between a sprint and Olympic, or maybe even longer distance. I know we do have some people who do longer distance.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good question. Thank you for bringing that up. So like with shorter races, we're going to have a little bit more wiggle room, again, because our body stores some of this stuff. So, you know, with a sprint, maybe just doing a little bit of sports drink on the bike, a little bit on the run maybe, but definitely have a lot more wiggle room there. As we start to increase the length, so get into like an Olympic distance, it's going to become even more important on the bike to make sure we're nailing our fueling and hydration. And then on the run, definitely making sure we're still getting fluids in so that we're not cramping. Because by the time we hit like an Olympic distance, that's long enough for a lot of people to start depleting glycogen, losing enough sweat that we're starting to like have problems cramping. Whereas that's typically, if you're heading into a sprint, you've had a good pre-race meal, you're heading into it hydrated, typically that's short enough that we're not going to see as many of like the cramping issues, bonking issues, just because our body stores can kind of get us through a lot of that. So as we increase the distance, like I said, into Olympic, into like half Ironmans, full Ironmans, it just becomes more and more important that we get really on top of the fueling, the hydration, all of that. And you're also going to probably, like for Ironman distances, you're going to want to make sure that pre-race meal is going to be a little bit more substantial. So maybe getting up earlier before the race, having a little bit more substantial meal. Whereas with like a sprint, we can kind of have something smaller, simpler, like we talked about with that pre-workout, like the same idea. So a couple hours before, having a couple of pieces of toast with peanut butter before a sprint. Whereas like an Ironman, we're maybe doing like oatmeal with fruit and honey, like whatever floats your boat, but something like a little bit more complex, a little heartier. Because as we get into like half Ironman and Ironman, you're like physically working so long that like you might actually start to get hungry. So we want to like have something more substantial. Does that cover that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions? If you want to, you can type in the chat, or you can take yourself off of mute and just ask them directly.
It doesn't even have to be like specific to like workout nutrition. If you just have like general nutrition questions, I'm open to fielding those as well.
Yeah, I will add in, so some of the key takeaways were kind of just trial and error, so seeing what works for you best and practicing that in your training now so that you know on race day exactly what to do. And then, you know, the importance of recovery. So that's really where you make the gains. So if you're not feeling yourselves after your workouts, there was really no point in doing your workout because you're just going to be breaking down your body and not really building it back up. So just making sure you get in those carbs and proteins afterwards are really important. And then two things we talked about, the sweat testing a lot. And then if you do want any like one-on-one nutritional counseling with Michael or with one of our other nutritionists, Sarah or Chris, that is one of the things that will give you guys 10% off. So if you're interested in that, you can reach out to one of us.
Yeah.
Guess we don't really have any questions. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Michael.
Yeah.
So I know we're kind of in a crazy time right now. Hopefully